Hi everyone. Briefly, by way of introduction, I'm David Mackay. I lead the growth and public services portfolio here at the Treasury. One of the things that I want to come back to, either in the few minutes that I've got with you now or when we're talking in smaller groups, is that idea that growth and public services aren't isolated from each other, but in fact more and more are something we need to be seeing as forming a pipeline or a continuum, one informing the other. So I wanted to speak briefly this afternoon about a few of the other dimensions of the Living Standards Framework, particularly those around social services, social inclusion, workforce participation, those kinds of things. I want to put a few ideas to you, pose a few questions in the hope that at least some of you will violently disagree with me at some point this afternoon, and we can get into that conversation in the smaller groups. So I should start with the good news. The good news is that international comparators tell us that New Zealand is probably pretty close to the global frontier of social inclusion performance. We're doing well in some areas. We are a bit more average in some, but we're holding our own globally. And I was very tempted to stop there and make that my pitch to you this afternoon, because, you know, a bit of warm and fuzzy, but I'll burst the bubble and go on. A number of the sectoral outcome measures that we look at, though, tell us that the trend from here is not good, either because things are declining in absolute terms, and there's been some references today to housing affordability, which is a pretty live example at the moment, or that they're declining relative to other countries. So, for instance, the performance of our education system is continuing to improve, but it's not improving as fast as other comparable countries. So, one way or another, the trend from here poses a pretty clear challenge to us. The graph that is up, incidentally, shows a measure of income inequality and shows that while it's been in New Zealand slightly higher than the OECD average, it's also been relatively stable for the past 20 years. So one of the questions that I would encourage you to be thinking about is that okay? Is it okay that that line, the New Zealand trend line there, has flattened out? And if not, what might we want to do about that? I take a couple of messages away from what the trends are telling us. One is that our public institutions could be doing better to help all New Zealanders to develop the capability and seize opportunities to participate fully in society and the economy. But it's also the case that the solution to doing that is increasingly sitting not in individual sectors or not in particular areas of activity, but much more in the gaps between them. And, you know, Sir Michael and Tim alluded earlier to links between education, skills development, workforce participation, and so on. So this is not just about being able to drive greater performance in the education system or in skills and training, but also about how you link that up across subject matters and across areas of activity. Government policy obviously has a big role to play here in talking about equality. But as soon as you use the word equality, particularly in relation to public services, the very next thing that you have to do is engage with what you mean by that word. And I think there's a discussion beginning now about what is meant by the idea of a universal service, and whether a universal service is in fact still the right way to approach things like healthcare, school education, and so on. Because if by equality we mean equality of service, then that takes you down one particular path where essentially the aim is for everyone to receive the same thing. But if you want to talk about equality of outcome, then the need for governments to get a lot more nuanced about how and where we invest public money, and with a focus on the greatest investment being targeted at those who need the most help to achieve an equitable outcome, brings you immediately down a very different policy path, and you're going to pursue a whole bunch of different policy options. So there's, it's very easy to write a headline about equality. It's very difficult to even write the first paragraph of the story that sits under the headline without needing to ask and answer some really tough questions, I think. There's a headline on that slide, social cohesion can be enhanced through government interventions. I should be clear, I don't mean that it can only be enhanced through government interventions. That's not my political philosophy at all. But I do think governments have a really important role to play here in promoting transparency, trust in government operations, and by delivering services that can directly promote cohesion, for instance, through the justice system, through policing, and so on. And that can also have a direct relationship to other dimensions of that 5-point living standards framework, where, for example, if economic growth per capita is declining and unemployment and inequality is increasing, you're likely to very quickly see flow-on effects in other parts of society, increasing crime rates, other indicators of cohesion starting to go backwards. And I think that underlines my earlier challenge to people to be thinking across sectors and across the gaps between our sort of traditional silos rather than looking for solutions only in one place or another. That's a very simple graph. It is a truism to say that the future is unpredictable and uncertain, and you probably heard the current fashionable management consultant jargon about saying that we live in a society that is VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And it's true. I mean, who would want to, right now, try and confidently predict what is going to happen even in the medium term, economically, geopolitically, even geologically? I come from a continent that is geologically very stable, and so every time something moves here in New Zealand, I get a little anxious. We perhaps don't have other forms of stability. We're going through prime ministers at an unsustainable rate at present, but it's hard to predict things. Whatever dimension you might want to look at, it's hard to predict. And yet, we need governments to be able to take decisions that are informed by what we can know and that help to prepare us for an uncertain future. So whether you think about Canterbury earthquakes or global financial crises, there are uncertainties out there which can have material and lasting impacts on living standards for which we need to prepare as best we can. So we need to take decisions either to help us to minimise risks. Tim talked before about some dimensions around economic diversification, things that help us to address those sorts of risks, or to ensure at least that we are well positioned to manage risks when they occur. We need to get comfortable operating in that grey zone of ambiguity and uncertainty. We also need to get better at harnessing whatever insights we can about the future and learning to put them to best use. Obviously, if we could, we would try and take policy decisions that would advance every dimension of this living standards framework all at the same time. And there are many policy interventions that are available to governments that can address multiple dimensions simultaneously. A classic example that comes up time and again is around investing in increased opportunities for vulnerable children. Better outcomes for vulnerable children themselves, social outcomes, educational outcomes, employment outcomes. Better outcomes as a result for New Zealand society and for the New Zealand economy, part of that pipeline of human capital that's so vital. And with my finance ministry hat on too, lower costs to future governments through the operation of the welfare system, operation of the justice system, and so on. So there are policy options and interventions out there that do help to push on most, if not all, of those 5 dimensions. But none of those policy decisions are easy, and there are always tensions and there are always trade-offs. I mean, apart from anything else, the resource base available to governments to spend is finite, but there are also tensions even at the policy level that need to be worked through every time one of these decisions comes up for ministers and senior decision makers to take. So, for example, you might want to increase government benefits to address inequality or reduce poverty, but that runs the risk of reducing incentives to work, lowering labour market participation, lowering the rate of economic growth and so on. So pulling on one lever inevitably involves keeping your eye on many others as well. So how do we best support decision makers to make these tough choices, because they are always tough? So Michael alluded before to the challenge or the opportunity of developing evidence-based policy. Getting better at finding that evidence and getting better at presenting that evidence to decision makers in a way that is helpful in making tough decisions and finding good options is a really important part of that. And that's not easy, but it's important work to be done. We are on the right track, I think, in holding ourselves in the public sector and more broadly to a higher standard of evidence about collecting data on what works and using that data then to inform a feedback loop that says we're not just going to put a policy setting in place and let it run for 30 years, but we actually want to see tangible, measurable change as a result of what we're doing. And if we're not seeing that, or not quite the way we want to adjust as we go, getting away from a sort of set and forget mindset and to be much more active in managing policy choices, investments, and so on. That's a very noble thing to say, and I thought I should just give you a quick example of how we do that. We have been using a cost-benefit analysis tool as part of our work on the budget process, and to disappoint you one step further, I'm not about to give you a sneak peek of what's in Budget 16. You will have to wait for Budget Day like everyone else. But what you've got here is a kind of anonymised summary of some of what we've been able to put together for ministers through the budget process by applying a common framework for cost-benefit analysis to spending proposals. And the graph here essentially maps out about a dozen proposals against strategic alignment over on the left-hand side here, which is essentially saying how well does a policy proposal or a spending proposal support the priorities of the government. And along the bottom, we've rated essentially the benefit-cost balance of a given proposal. This is on the Treasury website. The assumptions that underpin the model are public, and part of doing that is to encourage people to challenge those assumptions and to challenge their own thinking about how they're putting proposals together for government to consider. What it allows us to do is to put proposals from different sectors with different target groups with different aims on a common assessment platform that looks across sectors, it looks over the long term, in some cases up to about 50 years, and makes all of those assumptions transparent so that as new proposals are being considered, we are less perhaps swayed by the rhetorical gifts of whoever is proposing a particular course of action, and more able to introduce that element of evidence and data that underlies it into the conversation. So I just wanted to give a practical example, I guess, of how we are trying to walk the walk on using evidence to inform some of these investment decisions. And if you're interested, you'll find on the Treasury website both the tool but also all of the underlying data that we would welcome you engaging with and having a crack at. And I think that is it from me. Thank you. Yeah.